Last week, I made a video talking about all my favorite handhelds that are coming out later this year. And overall, I'm very excited for all those devices. But something I didn't talk about whatsoever are the upcoming emulation handhelds. The handhelds from Emrg40 XXV, even Miu, all have devices coming out at some point this year or early next year. And they're very, very interesting. This first section of handhelds I'm going to be discussing are all from the same company, so I'm just going to group them all here in the beginning. But that doesn't mean that they're like better or worse than the ones I'll talk about later in the video, so bear that in mind. IO has kind of gone on a bender recently, announcing and unveiling all these products. They did an unveiling of sorts of a huge new lineup of retro-themed devices. They did that a couple months ago. I think it's like 3 or 4 at least now. And some of those handhelds that they unveiled was the IO DMG and the IO Pocket Micro, I believe it's called. And those two devices in particular are well known, discussed, and expected to release basically around October, depending on which model you chose to pre-order. So not a lot of information is available hands-on with these devices, but we know pretty definitively what the specs are, RAM capacity, storage, and whatnot, and what performance to expect out of these devices. Because both these devices use well-known processors or processors used in other IO devices, like the IO DMG. That one uses the same Snapdragon G3 X2, which if you're familiar with my videos, you might have remembered that processor because it was also used in the IO Pocket S, which in my opinion was a less than stellar device, especially given how expensive it was. And seeing how expensive this device can get, frankly, leads me to believe that this device will suffer from the same exact problems, because this device is as cheap as about $350 or $340 depending on early bird pricing, and all the way up to almost $600 with early bird pricing. And standard pricing for both those devices is around $450 and $700. This is frankly a ludicrous amount of money to be spending on a retro device. Because we've already established in prior videos that the Snapdragon G3 X Gen 2 is technically more powerful than most of these other handhelds out there. It is capable of some impressive emulation, but lacks the developer support that standard Snapdragon chips have. Even lesser known chipsets have better driver support than this thing, because the devices that they come in are so darn expensive. For your nearly $700 when this thing is fully released, you'll get about 16 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage, which that's a lot of RAM in storage for an emulation handheld. And what I've learned in my experience is you don't really need more than 8 gigabytes of RAM. I use an Odin 2 base model, and that is the device I recommend most frequently, just because it is one of the best values in gaming. And that has a standard Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, it also has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and frankly, even when doing hardcore Nintendo Switch emulation, barely uses 100% of the memory. It uses anywhere between 6 to 7 gigabytes of RAM. So 8 gigs, you're fairly comfortable with that amount of memory. You don't need that much more, and any more, frankly, sees basically diminishing returns. You don't see that much more improvement. Maybe an FPS there or two, maybe slightly smoother performance, but it's not appreciably different from a base model device. And this device is going to suffer the same exact problems that the IO Pocket S did, which is being way too expensive, lacks developer support, and drivers need a lot of work to become truly usable. And on top of that, this is a DMG-styled handheld. Why do you need that much performance? This device is designed and optimized ergonomically for mostly 2D titles. I seriously don't understand why people keep putting these high-end chipsets in DMG-styled handhelds, because they're not the most comfortable way to play these 3D titles. And if you're doing it for the best 2D performance, you don't need to throw in over a terabyte of storage, because the entirety of the original NES's library is less than 500 megabytes. The entirety of the SNES's library is less than 2 gigabytes, and 64 is less than 6 gigs. Frankly, seeing 1 terabyte on most of these devices seems a little excessive, unless you're playing mostly PS2, original Xbox, GameCube titles, But this device, while powerful enough to do that, does not have enough buttons to do that. So I don't see why 1 terabyte was necessary. I don't see why all this performance is necessary. Rant aside, that device, while frustrating, another device does make a little bit more sense. The IO Pocket Micro is similarly quite pricey and suffers from similar issues of being a little too expensive, but makes a little bit more better justification for itself. Its higher build quality and decent enough performance makes it a decent enough purchase. So I wouldn't be too annoyed at this device, and it's not priced too egregiously. It just might not be the best value out there. As the name implies, it is supposed to be very similar to the Game Boy Micro, which was a decent enough device. I really liked it. It was a little small for my taste, and this device is going for a very similar vibe. On top of that, it uses a Helios G99 processor, which should be able to handle all the way up to basically N64 and PS1 emulation, not much higher than that. Unlike its bigger brother, this does have dual analog sticks, so it should be able to play all those 3D titles comfortably. The other device that IO announced is the IO Pocket Evo, which basically takes their standard, IO PC handheld design that we've gotten used to now and adapts it to an Android emulation handheld style. It uses the Snapdragon G3X once again, but in a much more affordable package, using very similar pricing to what you see, on the IO Pocket S. The difference being that this is a larger display and it uses the very similar RAM and storage options, except this one has an even higher tier with 24 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage, which, as I've established with the other device, is blatantly excessive. I already talked about how 16 gigs was too much, and now 24 gigs on top of that just seems even more excessive than 16 gigs was. I understand the justification for high amounts of storage, up to 1 terabyte and stuff like that, because you might want to do things other than emulate games on this. You might want to upload movies, other things to this device than just emulation stuff. So I understand some people wanting 1 terabyte, but 24 gigabytes of RAM to me just seems excessive. Moving on to the next device, I recently talked about this device not too long ago, the Emrg40 XXV, another DMG style layout device with an analog stick and not optimized for 3D games, but uses the same H700 chipset that we've grown to love and be annoyed by. While I would have liked to see a slightly higher end chipset, I'm okay with this H700 chipset because this device is going to be around $60, $50. Basically, this device knows what it's going to be used for and is priced accordingly and spec'd accordingly. It is an efficient use of budget and value that I feel like you could reasonably purchase this device and be satisfied by it if you know what you're buying. This device will only be a little bit smaller than the IO DMG handheld, so frankly, anybody who wants to buy that should probably just buy this device. To me, this makes a lot more sense than the IO DMG, because frankly, that device makes zero sense to me, as you could tell by my 5-minute long rant at the beginning of this video. Other than that, this device is going to be your pretty standard fare for when it comes to Emrg handhelds. It's clearly another notch in the belt and just another device to fill a gap in their lineup. And while I'm not too impressed by it, I'm also not annoyed by its very existence, unlike the IO DMG handheld, so you can give it a point for being inoffensive but unimpressive. The very last handheld I'm going to be discussing in this video is from Miyoo. I don't talk about Miyoo that often because they don't really release that many products. The Miyoo Flip was originally announced earlier last year, so not too long ago, and it's been in development for quite a while, and it's been delayed quite a few times to the point where the last time a release date was mentioned about this device was on July 31st. That's when it was supposed to come out, and for all I know, I can't find a single bit of information about when this thing is coming out, couldn't find any listings as if it was being sold, couldn't find any discussion posts about when it's coming out, so frankly, I'm a little confused. This device is supposed to be basically a knockoff version of the Emrg Flip device, which in of itself was a knockoff of the Game Boy Advance SP. But this device does a little bit different by having 2 analog sticks, which, using the old RK3566 processor that we have used and known about for a very, very long time in the emulation space, I don't expect to get a huge amount of use out of those dual analog sticks because you're not going to be emulating anything higher than N64 and PS1, and frankly, that might be a little tough. It might be hit or miss with those titles, so I wouldn't expect to get much use out of those, so anticipate disappointment if you expect 3D games to run really good. But I'm not a huge fan of this form factor, broadly speaking, because it's just a little uncomfortable. Moving on to the release dates for these devices, the first device I talked about, the iNeo DMG, that is set to release this October if you pre-ordered it, and expect to wait a while now if you decided to finally pre-order the device, probably not until early next year. The Micro is set to release in September of this year. The Emrg40 XXV is set to release on August 29th, so at the end of this month. And lastly, Miyu's Flip device, I honestly have no idea when it's coming out, so I wouldn't hold my breath. I would love to hear what you guys think about this though. Are you interested in any of these emulation handhelds? Do you agree with my utter befuddlement and anger about the iNeo DMG? I would love to hear what you guys think about this down below, and don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media coverage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.